Canada controls the water that powers your lights, protects your home from floods, and keeps the internet running. And Donald Trump just picked a fight with the one man who knows exactly how to use it. What happens next could reshape North America before summer ends. And most people have no idea it's even happening. Stay with me because the story you've been told about this conflict is missing the most important part. 40% of all hydroelectric power in the United States flows from one river system, the Columbia Basin. It doesn't just run turbines. It waters $8 billion in American crops annually, moves 42 million tons of commercial cargo, and powers the data centers behind every Google search you've made today. The data centers running artificial intelligence, the servers keeping the internet online right now. And the upstream flow of that entire system sits inside Canadian territory. That single fact is the thing the Trump administration has been banking on you not knowing. If you're finding this useful, hit like right now. We track this story every single day, and the next update could change everything. Here's where it gets complicated. The Columbia River Treaty was signed in 1961 under President Eisenhower. Canada agreed to build massive dams along the river in British Columbia, structures that absorbed floodwaters that had destroyed American communities for generations. In 1948, a single flood erased the entire city of Vanport, Oregon in one night. 18,000 people lost everything by morning. Canada's dams made sure that never happened again. In exchange, Canada received half the additional hydroelectric power generated on the American side. For 61 years, both nations honored that deal. Then, key provisions expired in 2024. 6 years of renegotiation produced a new framework under Biden and Trudeau, a fresh 20-year agreement, fully drafted, ready for Senate approval. It didn't make it across the finish line before Inauguration Day. And in March 2025, the Trump administration suspended the talks entirely. That decision didn't happen in a vacuum. Go back to January 2025. Trump called Trudeau to discuss tariffs. 25% duties on nearly every Canadian product, set to begin the next day. Trudeau secured a 30-day delay. But what most reporting skipped over entirely is what else Trump raised during that call. He brought up the water agreements. He mentioned NORAD. He floated the idea of Canada becoming the 51st state. Then Trudeau stepped down, and the water question landed in the hands of someone Washington was not prepared for. Mark Carney had previously governed the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England. He steered two of the world's major economies through the 2008 financial crisis and Brexit. When the Liberal Party chose him to replace Trudeau in early March 2025, his party was polling at 19%. The Conservatives held a 25-point lead. A Liberal victory looked mathematically impossible. Then Trump kept talking. He called Canada's elected Prime Minister Governor Trudeau. He posted on Truth Social that Canada exists because of the United States. He enforced 25% broad tariffs on Canadian auto workers, steel workers, and lumber producers. He threatened to double duties on Canadian steel and aluminum when Ontario's premier pushed back. And something unexpected happened across Canada. Not the short-lived frustration of a bad news cycle, but a deep, sustained national fury. Canadians stopped traveling to the United States. Boycotts of American goods spread across supermarkets. And the man who had campaigned on steady, calm leadership began to look exactly like what the moment demanded. Carney won the April 28, 2025 federal election. Not just a win, a majority government. On election night, he said this: "Trump seeks to shatter us so America can possess us." That is now the man who controls the upstream flow of the Columbia River. Pause on that for a second, because this is where the narrative stops being political theater and becomes a question about concrete systems that affect your daily life. Drop a comment right now. Do you think Trump understood what he was triggering when he froze the Columbia River Treaty talks? Because here is what American legal specialists, not Canadian politicians, American law professors at the University of Idaho, have concluded after studying this framework for years. A breakdown of the Columbia River Treaty would hurt the United States more than Canada. That means forfeiting organized flood protection for Portland and the entire Pacific Northwest. It means losing reliable hydroelectric power for millions of households and businesses. It means unraveling systems that have quietly held an entire region together since the Kennedy administration. Trump once described the Columbia River as a massive tap in Canada that could deliver water to California. That framing reveals the fundamental miscalculation at the center of his approach. That tap doesn't exist to hydrate California. It exists to keep Oregon from flooding. And it works because Canada committed for 61 years under a treaty that Trump's own State Department has now refused to finish modernizing. But here is the layer most people have completely missed, and it may be the most consequential legal detail in this entire story. Canada passed the Transboundary Waters Protection Act in 2013. It was designed specifically for situations like this, to prevent any future American government from forcing Canada to treat its rivers as exportable commodities. It looks airtight, but buried inside the USMCA, the trade deal Donald Trump negotiated, signed, and celebrated as the signature achievement of his first term, there is a provision that creates a significant opening. The USMCA side agreement excludes natural water from standard trade rules. That sounds protective. The problem is what happens after that water gets processed. Once water is dammed, rerouted, stored, or otherwise altered, it may no longer qualify as natural water under the standardized commodity classification systems used by the WTO and GATT. Once reclassified, it becomes a product. And once it's a product, every trade rule embedded in the USMCA applies, including clauses that could make Canada's prohibition on exporting that water legally challengeable. State it plainly, the very dams Canada built to protect the United States from floods may have inadvertently converted the Columbia River's water into a tradable commodity, now subject to the same trade architecture Trump is currently wielding. John Wagner, an environmental policy professor at the University of British Columbia and a recognized treaty specialist, has noted that Trump lacks the authority to simply suspend interim agreements that have already been confirmed by both nations through formal diplomatic notes. Those hold legal force independent of the broader negotiation freeze. That offers Canada one layer of protection, but the processed water question remains unresolved, exactly the kind of legal ambiguity that pressure campaigns are designed to exploit. Now, here is the part that should concern Washington most. As of April 2026, Trump's approval rating sits at 36%. Two senior cabinet members have departed, former Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem and former Attorney General Pam Bondi. A Supreme Court ruling in February 2026 struck down EPA-based tariffs on Canada and Mexico, introducing fresh legal uncertainty across the entire tariff structure. Every additional round of tariffs adds to American inflation, and American consumers are already feeling it. Carney, by contrast, holds a majority government and faces no election for years. He has domestic authorization, a legal team that has reviewed every line of the same treaty documents Trump's advisors have, and a diversification strategy actively pulling Canadian trade toward Asia and Europe. In January 2026, Canada finalized an agreement with China reducing duties on Canadian agricultural products. China cut tariffs on up to 49,000 Canadian electric vehicles. Trump responded on Truth Social, warning of 100% tariffs on all Canadian goods if Canada deepened its China ties. Carney held firm. In an April 2026 address, he said openly, "The U.S. has fundamentally altered its trade approach, pushing tariffs to levels not seen since the Great Depression. Several of our past advantages, rooted in our tight connection with America, have turned into liabilities." That is not negotiating language. That is a strategic declaration, and it should reframe everything that follows. Which brings us to July 2026, the deadline that matters more than any individual tariff announcement. That month, the full USMCA agreement comes up for scheduled review. All three parties, the United States, Canada, and Mexico, can signal whether they want continuation, modification, or the beginning of withdrawal proceedings. It is the moment this conflict either finds a negotiated exit or hardens into something structurally different. Three paths lead into that moment, and they don't carry equal probability. The first is negotiated balance, Trump's domestic vulnerabilities, the Supreme Court tariff ruling, and the real infrastructure costs of a Columbia River treaty failure push both sides toward a managed settlement. Reduced tariffs in exchange for Canadian commitments on border security and defense spending, the water treaty completed quietly. Both governments declare success. The The tension subsides without either side formally conceding. This requires Trump to stop demanding things Canada cannot legally or politically deliver. And there is no clear signal yet that he intends to. The second path is controlled drift. No deal by July. The USMCA review produces no resolution. Both sides hold their positions. Tariffs stay elevated. The Columbia River Treaty remains in limbo under temporary measures. Canada continues deepening ties with Asia and Europe. American Pacific Northwest farmers and energy providers keep absorbing the costs of prolonged uncertainty. This is the most likely path at present. Not a sudden rupture, but a slow erosion of the framework that has anchored North American economic integration for 6 decades. The third path is escalation. Canada strengthens its China relationship past the threshold the Trump administration will accept. The 100% tariff threat becomes real. Canada responds by activating its water treaty leverage more explicitly, either signaling intent to initiate the 10-year termination process on the Columbia River Treaty or restricting energy flows more aggressively than it has so far. This is the least likely scenario in the near term, but it carries the most permanent consequences. Once the 10-year termination clock starts on the Columbia River Treaty, there is no quick reversal. There is one more thing that runs beneath all 3 of these paths, something that deserves to be said plainly. The person who built Canada's leverage in this confrontation is Donald Trump. Not Carney, not Trudeau, not any Canadian politician who wanted a harder line. The Liberal Party was at 19% when Trump began his pressure campaign. The moment he called Canada's democratically elected leader Governor Trudeau, the moment he posted that Canada exists because of the United States, he didn't weaken the opposition, he created it. He transformed a country drifting toward a conservative government aligned with Washington into one led by a prime minister with a popular mandate to resist. That is the political error underneath every strategic error in this story. You do not improve your negotiating position by producing the very adversary most committed to telling you no. Crystal Spicer grew up on a farm in Edgewood, British Columbia. Her family's property disappeared under the reservoir created when Canada built the Arrow Lakes Dam, one of the dams constructed in the 1960s to fulfill the terms of the Columbia River Treaty. She watched the valley of her childhood go underwater. Her family gave up their land as part of an agreement between 2 neighboring countries that trusted each other enough to build something that lasted 61 years. She told CBC News she still cannot bring herself to look at that reservoir. "It changed so completely," she said. "I'll always remember the paradise it used to be." 60 years later, the country her family supported through that sacrifice is being asked to hand over its ports. And its prime minister is saying no. The dams Canada built are still releasing water southward every day. The Columbia River is still crossing the border, still generating American electricity, still holding back American floods. The structure of mutual trust that made all of it possible, built across 6 decades, nearly completed under Biden, suspended under Trump, remains the most consequential unresolved infrastructure question in North America. Senator Maria Cantwell said it clearly. This should not become another casualty of a trade conflict with Canada, a country that stood beside the United States through 2 world wars, Korea, Afghanistan, and across a border that for most of recent history required no pressure at all. Whether Washington absorbs that reality before July or only after, that is the question this story has not yet answered. If this analysis changed how you see this conflict, share it with one person who needs to understand what's actually at stake. Comment below. Which of the 3 paths do you think plays out before July? We cover this story every single day, and the next development could arrive before this week is out. If you want to be the person in the room who actually understands what's happening between the US and Canada, not just the headlines, but the systems, the leverage, and the legal architecture underneath it all, subscribing takes 2 seconds, and it keeps you ahead of every news cycle that matters.